I qualified for this introduction because, first of all, Tobias and I teach in the same spot and sort of run by each other several times every semester. But this is the first time that I've really gotten to know him because I have to introduce him. So what I've learned is that Tobias was fascinated since his childhood by the jumble of neighborhood signing that he found around where he lived, both in the United States and in Great Britain. But he now finds himself celebrated as one of the world's leading typeface designers, creating some of the most iconic and widely used typefaces like Gotham, Interstate, Retina, and Whitney, the friendly and contemporary / old style face that Doug Scott and I just happened to choose as the signature font for WGBH, the local Boston PBS station where I used to work. You can find Tobias's designs, if you look hard, in the permanent collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and MoMA in New York, among other institutions. And he's been honored with the AIGA Medal and most recently, Cooper Hewitt's 2019 National Design Award. And this is only the second time this prize has been conferred for typeface design. The first being the Society of Printers' own Matthew Carter. Fired up by his fascination with letters, Tobias got his BFA in graphic design from RISD in 1992. He followed that by an MFA from Yale, which then turned around a few years later and hired him to teach type design alongside, you guessed it, the very same Matthew Carter. Nowadays, Tobias is the proprietor of Frere-Jones Type in Brooklyn, but he's also an avid collector of type specimens and an excellent writer, which I discovered by reading his terrific blog posts on the thinking that goes into defining the bones and the personality of a typeface. Tobias says that his presentation tonight is entitled "In Letters We Trust," and it will draw on his ongoing research in the use of letter forms as a means of security for citizens and governments alike, thwarting forgery in plain sight and in secret, using the strategies that have relied on high-profile collaborations or sometimes just homegrown cunning. He promises that this is a gripping story of war and peace, technology, culture, economics, and even type design. So welcome, Tobias, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I should I just want to correct the record that I don't actually have an MFA from Yale, though I do. I have been teaching there since. Not a problem. If they want to give me one, then yeah, I won't say no. But thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Society of Printers for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Let me just move over here. Okay. Everything looking good there? Yes. Okay. So as Chris mentioned, this talk is really a kind of sort of interim report of research that I've been doing on and off for several years. I've been designing type for I think it's about 30 years now. I realized recently that I've actually been collecting ephemera. First, it was banknotes, for actually longer than that. And it's been a kind of reference point for a lot of how I understand sort of the typographic universe that we live in. And there are also good examples of letters that have a job to do. I've always liked, letters that, or any kind of typography that gets something done, apart from just looking beautiful. And this was something that I've been wanting to look into for some time. And I originally thought that I was going to write a blog post about this. And then as I gathered together the ideas and the examples, I realized that I had something much larger. So I realized this couldn't really be a blog post, it had to be something more comprehensive than that. So this idea of letters as a form of security is actually quite an old one. The most familiar example of this is also one of the oldest in our signature. And we've been using our signature, our rendering of our name, for over 1,000 years to verify our identity and vouch for the security of a document, and so on. And it's a pretty clever idea to leverage the sort of weirdness of our own individual musculature and anatomy and how we render letters into some kind of unique mark that we can put on something, like a little padlock made of letters. But it also has an emotional aspect to it. So being handmade, we expect these to reflect something about us and deliver some part of our personality in them. And that emotional part of it, sort of implication about who we are and how we operate in the world, is part of one of the first examples that we'll look at. It concerns this fellow, is Jack Lew. He was originally President Obama's chief of staff, and in 2013 he was nominated to be the new Secretary of the Treasury. And in the press there were questions about whether or not this was a good nomination and what kind of plans Lew would have for economic recovery and so on, and all those usual questions you would expect to hear in the wake of following a cabinet nomination. And then while a reporter was reviewing documents from Lew's tenure as Obama's chief of staff, he noticed Lew's signature, which looks like this. And for about a week, this story got very, very silly. And people wanted to know how we could trust someone who writes their name like this smash slinky of a signature. And it also had something more kind of visceral to it, because as Secretary of the Treasury, Lew's signature would be on all of our money that would be produced during his tenure in that position. No other member of the federal cabinet has their signature on display like the Secretary of the Treasury does. And so it was really sort of an awkward moment, in the sort of uncertainty after the crash to wonder if what kind of person is going to be running the Treasury. And Obama had to eventually address this in public, and said, "I had never noticed Jack's signature. And when this was highlighted in the press, I considered rescinding my offer to appoint him. Jack assures me that he is going to work to make at least one letter legible in order not to debase our currency, should he be confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury." And I would have to check with the appropriate scholars, but I'm pretty sure that no president has ever called someone out in public for their handwriting, but that's what Obama had to do. In the end, Liu was confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury, and he went off somewhere to practice his signature and came back with this, which is what's actually on our money now that was printed in that period. It looks more like Paul J. something, but I think we can at least agree that these are actually letters. But that's sort of makes our segue into where a large part of this story will take place is in the printing of money. And we can, in thinking about this, of sort of broadly divided the kind of means of security into two categories. The first larger one being the attempts to create some new item, some new document, and make it look like some legitimate body has actually produced that. Obviously, the most common target for that is paper money. And Ben Franklin, obviously, in addition to being the statesman and scientist and philosopher, he was, of course, a printer throughout his entire life, and merged that into all of the other things that he did. And he was the official printer for the state of Pennsylvania for many years. And one of the responsibilities for the official state printer in that time was to print the money that the state would issue. During the colonial period, each state issued their own money. There was no common currency. And he concerned himself again and again with the idea of security and making Pennsylvania's money as secure and unforgeable as he could manage. One of his innovations was a technique he developed where you would take leaves from native plants and trees and make a casting of them and print them on the money. He shared that technology with only two other states, New Jersey, who produced this note we have here, and Massachusetts. You can consider this very sensitive tech that he wasn't going to give to just anybody. Another device that he fixed upon for making Pennsylvania's money secure was the type. And this note printed by Franklin's partners, Hall and Sellers, uses not only the kind of the sort of English old style, Caslon style kind of text but also this sort of loopy, energetic script that doesn't appear in the inventory of any American printer. It also doesn't appear in the inventory of any British foundry at the time. And it was, as it turns out, a font of type that Franklin picked up in England as a teenager when he was over there learning, as an apprentice, learning the craft of printing. And it's not clear why Franklin bought this, but the foundry that that issued this was a small foundry that was then absorbed into other foundries. And by the time Franklin was back in the States, this face was not available anywhere. It had gone off the market. So Franklin realized that he had something unique, something that just could not be bought off a shelf. And that exclusivity, sort of accidental though it was something that could be leveraged into making notes that could not be reproduced by someone else. Shortly after independence, Franklin was appointed to be ambassador to France, and once again made printing and typography part of his discharge of that position. He even moved a press and even a small type foundry into the house where he set up outside of Paris, because I guess that's the thing you would do if you're Ben Franklin. And one of his responsibilities as the American ambassador to France was the issue of passports. And again, being a sensitive document, there's a target for forgers, he worked to make this secure, and in this case, commissioned Pierre-Simon Fournier to create a custom typeface for him, just for the production of these passports. And also a bit of sleight of hand on press to make these, to print these. We can see in the first and second and third lines, the way these descenders and swashes are cutting over each other. Also, it sort of makes us feel a bit more like something handwritten. It's also a bit baffling to figure out how to print it. In this case, Franklin had set up two chases. One held the first, third, fifth, seventh, and so on lines of this text. The second one had the second, fourth, sixth, and so on, and just ran it through the press twice, right? You could get all these overlaps between them. I thought it was a really sneaky trick to pull there. While he was over in France, Franklin also brought his grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, along with him, and arranged with Francois Ambroise Didot of the Didot family to teach his grandson the craft of punch cutting. I will come back to Franklin's grandson a little bit later. For the other states in the American colonies, couldn't rely on flashy, big name type commissions or fancy printing technology. They only had what was available to them in their print shop. That's all they had. And one printer who was especially resourceful and creative in this regard was the Green family, William Green, and then later his widow, Anne Catherine Green, were the printers for the state of Maryland. And the Greens used a technique that would later be dubbed secret marks, which are deliberate flaws that are put into the composition, into the typesetting of the document, with the goal of being accidentally corrected by a forger. For example, here in the word indented, the second D in this word is actually not a D, it's actually a P that's been rotated and put there. And if you know to look for it, you can see it. If you don't know that it's there, you'll probably gloss right over it. If you're trying to reproduce this, you'll just put D there and thus reveal yourself as a forger. And so the Green, the notes printed by the Green family have all of these little deliberate mistakes all over them, like these rotated small cap N's, the word London. Others have modified letters snuck into their notes, often with an unaltered version of that same letter nearby, so you can make the comparison more easily. And in this case, this note from 1770, one of the greens took a file to the descender loop of that G and cut through it. And while I was researching this, I looked at 3 different copies of this note just to be sure that I wasn't looking at some sort of printing error, and someone really did cut through the bottom of that G to make this kind of Baskerville-y kind of open tail right next to the more conventional form. This was one of my favorites, examples of the greens at work. Here in these 3 lowercase o's are actually 2 lowercase o's and an old style 0 that's snuck into the middle of the word gold. And elsewhere on the bill, you can see the 0 where you'd expect to find it in the date 1770, next to the dropped period, which is a common device that they would use. And in addition to this being really sort of clever, I showed this to Matthew Whitman at the American Numismatic Society, where it's doing a lot of this part of the research. And he told me that people had been writing about the Green family's notes from Maryland since the 60s or something, and no one had ever spotted this one. That this I actually added to the body of knowledge about numismatic history that made my whole day there. And as one more example, where here in the lowercase I, and this was one example with the alignment as you'd expect it, and another with the dot shifted off to the left. And I'll assume there's some number of the folks in the audience here have worked in with handset type and a letterpress. And I can really appreciate how much of a hassle it would be to take a saw to a piece of like 12-point type, this is about, and saw off the top half of one piece of type and shift it sideways and lock this all up so it won't move. It's pretty, I was sort of both amused and impressed to see how they were thinking about this. Another printer I was looking at worked for the state of Virginia. Unfortunately, this printer never signed his work, so we don't know who it is we're talking about here. But this printer used the sort of ornate and partially alien structure of black letter capitals as the opportunity to slip in some traps. Oops. The first line of this piece of text is supposed to say this bill of however many, whatever denomination. And instead of a capital B, it's a capital Q. And I believe this was actually a decoy because it's so obviously wrong that you would actually notice this. And you say, aha, you're not going to trick me. I'm going to stick a cap Q in there. The real trap is actually elsewhere in the bill. It's in the word treasury, which appears a little further down in the text. The sneaky thing being that that third letter is not an E. It's actually a G. Elsewhere we get the word currency, and you can see what the capital E is supposed to look like. And elsewhere we get the G in the word Virginia, and you can see that this actually does not say treasury, it says trigazzery. But I think it's a really impressive use of sort of how familiar an audience is or is not with a set of shapes to leverage to make something more secure. I mentioned earlier Benjamin Franklin Bache learning the craft of punch cutting. After returning from France, the elder Franklin was hoping to set up his grandson with a new type foundry in Philadelphia. Bought the materials off of Fournier for type casting and molds and everything else to set up a new foundry. Franklin wanted to start a new typographic tradition in the States based on French traditions. He thought that this would be part of the break from England, would also be to break from the typographic traditions of Caslon and all of those, and start with the likes of Fournier and Dito and so on. Unfortunately, American printers didn't want any of that stuff. They really did want their Caslon. So, and Beige was not actually that interested in being a type founder and went off and ran a newspaper instead. But before all of that, Beige printed this note for the Bank of North America, which is the second attempt to make a common currency among all of the states. And it contains what seems to be special letters cut by Beige for this purpose. And it's probably some of the weirdest typography I've seen in any note. It's these sort of extra loops and slashes and odd cedilla off the lowercase t. Sure, why not? These seem to be sort of extra obstacles to throw in the path of a forger to make it really impossible to use something off the shelf to produce this. So there's obviously nothing subtle about the way this is being done. It is interesting to note, I haven't figured this out, but for some reason, all of the vowels in this text are untouched. Everything else has gotten some kind of twist or turn or extra bit added to it. I'm not sure what that strategy was about. This is backing up a little bit, but it's important to know that the backdrop for a lot of this work was wartime. One of the first acts of the new Continental Congress, once it was established, among their first acts was to start issuing currency that would be common among all of the colonies, to bind their economies together and become a stronger opponent against Britain. And the British understood, or I should back up and say, in this note, you see that same loopy script that we saw earlier from this obscure English foundry, shows up again for the same purposes, alongside what would later be revived as Union Pearl, where it says continental currency, so on and so on across the top. That's another oddball ornamental thing. But the British understood the danger that was posed to them by this idea of a common currency. And as soon as they heard about this, started a program of mass forgery to make fake continental dollars and use the captured city of New York as a center of distributing them among the rest of the colonies to undermine this attempt to bind the states together. Unfortunately for the Americans, the British were really good at this and succeeded in wrecking the continental dollar. And to the point that in 1779, the Continental Congress had to issue a broadside alerting the public to these British counterfeits. And I won't read through the whole thing. I've read this whole broadside, and about 3/4 of this description is about type at this kind of scale that we've already been looking at. There are notes here about looking for a lowercase y whose descender is a bit too long, and looking for stems of a lowercase n and m that are a bit too heavy. And I'm pretty sure that this is one of the few times, or the only time, that sort of awareness of typography became a kind of a matter of sort of national security for the colonists, to try to preserve the integrity of the money they were trying to establish. It wasn't enough, and after a couple of years, the value of the continental dollar had degraded to the point that it had to be abandoned. But a few years after that, it was England's turn to have a problem with forgery. After about a century of near constant warfare with the Dutch or the French or their colonies, or establishing new colonies and so on, England was broke and needed to pay off its debts. And to help in that effort, the Bank of England called all of their gold coinage in small denominations, in 1 and 5 pound denominations, and replaced them all with these paper proxies. And this wasn't, the implications weren't thought out so well, because the notes that they used had very little to obstruct any kind of forgery. Originally, these notes, became called the white notes, were used for very large sums, and would be used in transactions where everyone knew each other, and thus, forgery wouldn't really come up. But once you get down to these smaller denominations, they become parts of transactions between strangers, and which is an important condition to be able to make that first pass of a forged note. And the Bank of England didn't really think this through, and these white notes were forged over and over and over again. And between I think it was 1808 and 1815, I believe it was, 800 people were tried and convicted for forgery, and many of them sent to the prison colony of Australia on the other side of the planet, which had some interesting implications for the history of Australia, but I can get to that later. But in 1819, hoping to step into this problem, where the Bank of England had tried to solve an economic problem and created a social one in its place, the Society of Arts presented this unsolicited report, where they asked craftsmen and merchants and other manufacturers about any kind of ideas about that could be put in front of the Bank of England to make the money more secure. One of them was the engineer Richard Williamson, who had just invented this mechanical engraving machine called the Rose engine. And this sort of, and his proposal was to make a massively intricate engraving, and this was his suggestion, and just print this on the back of the notes. So that the backs of these notes were always blank. This was one of their many weaknesses. Rather than change anything on the front, you can just take all the notes you already have, print this on the back. Forgers will never be able to keep up with this, and you'll be done. The Bank of England didn't like that idea. But what I think one of the more interesting ideas came from Thomas Curzon Hansard, who's the official printer for Parliament. And his idea was to, hang on a second, I got this Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry, I've got a window and sort of part in front of my own slide here. But to fix upon a form of type, and most of all, a size of type, in his that would be very difficult to produce because it was so small. And his suggestion was to use the diamond size of type, which in our point system translates to about a 4.5 point size of type. And there were, in fact, very few people around who were capable of cutting type that small. And remember, this was a period where the punches for type were cut by hand at size. And the mechanical engraving of punches or matrices was really not a reality at this point. So it was very rare to find someone who could produce these in the first place. And part of Curzon's, Curzon Hansard's proposal not only included this new sort of legal status for 4.5 point type, but also ideas about how it would be composed. I think of ASCII art as some 20th century thing, but this fellow was here before all of us. This was Hansard's idea for what British currency ought to look like. This is not an illustration with commentary around it. All of this is, except for the little caption up top, all of this is what he thought the banknote should look like. Even today, this looks so removed from our idea of what money should be. I can just imagine that at the time this was just off the charts. So it's just an absolute non-starter. The columns of type along the bottom are is the text of the statute that establishes forgery as something illegal and details all the awful things that will happen to you if you try to forge this note. But each line is numbered so that if something, if some tiny detail of this looks dodgy, you can call it out immediately by saying, if you look at the second letter of the third word on line 106, and so on, you can, becomes a kind of map of checks on how well this would be produced. And obviously this did not happen. In the end, the Bank of England decided that their notes were fine and did not need any help at all. And made only superficial changes for the next 100 years or so. And when during World War II, the Nazis began their campaign of mass counterfeiting and made thousands of these white notes with the aim of wrecking the British economy. And unfortunately for the British, they were really good at it. The way the Bank of England tells it, though, only one counterfeit note ever made it through the British banking system. By another account, the Bank of England was filtering Nazi forgeries out of the economy well into the 60s. So you can see which one of those sounds more plausible. Though it didn't catch on with the Bank of England, but the idea of using very, very small type did make appearances in the American history of banknote design. And towards the end of the 19th century, the engraving technology had grown to the point that engravers could actually be fitting letters inside other letters. This is from one of the various notes that the Bureau of Engraving and Printing was producing at the time. We think of the Treasury as producing just dollar bills that we use. At the time, the Treasury was issuing multiple kinds of currency, dollars issued backed by gold or backed by silver or other kinds of promissory notes and so on. So there are multiple series of bills being produced and designed, and the designs were refreshed on a regular basis. So there's this flood of work coming out of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. This is just, we'll just see a tiny piece of it. I think it's another thing that's noteworthy here is this isn't just letters inside letters, it's multiple styles of letters. There's a sans, there's a serif, there's an italic, there's a black letter, and even little US monograms inside the ball terminals. This was another kind of sort of behind the scenes measure of security, because at the engraving office, there would be one person trained in a single style of lettering. There'd be the guy who does the block lettering, and that's all this person does. There'd be someone else who does the high contrast modern. There'd be someone else who does the black letter. And it wouldn't be possible to find all of those skills in one person. If you're trying to forge this, you'd have to keep adding people to your enterprise, and it just becomes easier to be found out the more people you add to your scheme. I think one of the best examples of really small lettering comes from this note, issued in 1896. It was a series of a silver-backed series that became later known as the Education series, and the scholars and the collectors often regard these notes as some of the most beautiful notes that the U.S. has ever produced. And sort of having looked through a lot of this history, I'm inclined to agree with that. And in this note, the $1 note, we see the figure of history literally taking youth under her arm and imparting wisdom. And one of the lessons apparently is reading the Constitution of the United States. It's over on the other side of the bill. This contains, I think it was the first 130 something words of the Constitution. I'd really like to think there was some kind of line break problem at the bottom of the first page that just could not be resolved, and some piece of foliage had to sort of fall there and fix that. And this is engraved. It's not type, but if it were type, it would be about 2.5 point. It's incredibly small, but I've seen this note in person, and it is super, super clear. It's an absolutely beautiful thing to behold. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think you'll permit. This is the $5 note from the same series, and it's impressive for a lot of reasons. First of which being how spectacularly dramatic this whole composition is. I mean, it's basically a movie poster, ready-made. Just needs some names across the bottom and a date, and there you've got your summer blockbuster. And in the center of this this tableau, you see the figure of progress holding up what you could possibly take to be a chicken drumstick, but it's not. It's a light bulb, and she is proclaiming electricity to be the new dominant force throughout the land. This very full steam ahead, spirit of progress, manifest destiny, all of that. And she is, for no especially good reason, partially topless. And it's not really part of the story, but it's how this engraver thought that's how you do neoclassical. And some members of the public were appalled by this. They wanted to know how the US government could issue something so indecent, so vulgar as this. And particularly around Boston, actually was the center of a lot of the uproar over this, this design, to the point that some banks in the Boston area refused to accept this note as a form of deposit, so to placate their Brahmin clients that were so up in arms. The Treasury Department was slow to respond to this controversy and started to plan what we would think of as a bug fix, sort of a revised engraving that just moved the drapery over, made this all more chaste, and they could just get on with it. Unfortunately, they were too slow about it, and it was decided that the only way to quash this controversy and this embarrassment was to cancel everything. There was a $2 note I didn't show, but there was a 10 and a 20 that were about to go into production. There were a 50 and 100 that were about to be sketched out. Everything was canceled. Everyone was sent home. And the Bureau followed up with a replacement note in 1899 that was pretty much the dullest thing they could think of. So as not to offend anybody. Though to be fair, that bird is stark naked. Just be clear about that. But if you take one of those two vignettes you see along the bottom, make it bigger, move it to the top, straighten out the line of type, you get this. And if you swap out the blue for green, take out references to silver, you'll get something very familiar. And I had wondered for years how the US got from this spectacular explosion of typographic invention to some of the dullest stuff that's ever existed. Turns out it was damage control from a scandal 120 years ago that everyone's forgotten what happened with this a tiny bit of nudity on one bill that blew up into this whole thing. That's how we got the dullest money in the world. I always wondered about that. In any case. So to say a bit about the other kind of category that we could talk about, where instead of fabricating something from whole cloth, as it were, to take something that a legitimate body has already issued and altering it to be more valuable in whatever way. And one of the, I found one of the better, many of the better examples of this technique come from lottery tickets, where the thing that you would want to alter is the serial number on this lottery ticket. Once you find out what the winning number is, then you can take the one you got and try to change that 5 into a 3 or that 3 into an 8 or something to make it the winning ticket. And kind of some really great examples from the French lottery tickets, starting with this series from the 30s, where I haven't been able to find out where or when these numbers were commissioned, but they've been drawn in a way that add these extra serifs and gaps that would get in the way of any kind of alteration to turn one number into another and turn a losing ticket into a winning ticket. It'll also be probably the only time that you'll see a figure 8 with serifs. So take a moment to appreciate that. Found some more examples with this parallel series of tickets or issued in the 30s, where the kinds of agreements or similarities we expect to see between the letters have been pretty deliberately and forcefully detached from one another. So we expect some kind of congruence between the 6 and 9, completely taken apart. I would not expect these parts of the 3 and 5 to be exact replicas of one another, but they certainly have some kind of sympathy for each other. Here, they obviously do not, and that's kind of the point, that they, all of these shapes do not want to have anything to do with each other. It's continued with each revision of the design of the tickets and the stamps. In this example from the late 60s, they had developed a series of numbers with these extra gaps and dots that seemed to be there to obstruct, again, obstruct any attempt to turn one letter into another. It's also one of the earlier examples of what I've been calling self-verifying numbers, where there's some indication of the word that number spelled out, either in whole or in part, underneath that number, that digit. There is another really surprising example I found. That was from one company, the American Totalizator company, who made the machinery that would tabulate bets at racetracks and issue the tickets that you would hold and return in the case that your bet was successful. And they made a system where each ticket was accompanied by a unique 5-letter code where for each race that was held that day. And these were made further distinguished from each other by the style of each letter that was produced there. So it wasn't just that it was Z, K, C, V, U, but it was the serif to Z and the shadowed K and the script C and so on and so on. And I managed to track down enough of these to get a pretty good sense of what this company had gotten these machines to produce for them. I believe it was 12 different styles of letters, plus these little icon, these sort of mid-century emoji looking things are added in there as well, like hearts and acorns and rocking horses. And obviously, in addition to all that, the color of the paper stock is also changing. Over the Soviet Union, the lotteries run by the state were using a different approach to securing the serial numbers on their tickets with numbers inside numbers, a bit like the American example we saw, the letters inside letters. Some of this always looked like these were numbers that were pregnant or something, like the 9's having twins. Congratulations. We find another example of self-verifying numbers from the lottery tickets from Bulgaria. With these tickets that were produced. I found examples of this going back to the late 30s, but there's most of the examples that are available now are from the 60s through the 90s. I just want to take a moment to appreciate that this absolutely spectacular, beautiful design was being produced by a government agency. And it's just, I don't know, it's just, perhaps I'm cynical, but I don't expect government agencies to produce anything that looks like this anymore. And to finish up, obviously a pre-pandemic view of New York. If you ever visit the city, whenever that's a prudent thing to do, you'll find these coffee carts around the city, especially in Manhattan. I believe they're the only reason that anything happens in New York before noon, are these carts that sell coffee and donuts. And if you come by one of these carts, you get a look right about there. You'll see the license that's been issued by the New York City Department of Health for this that allows this cart to operate. And went around and talked enough people into letting me photograph their license and convince them that I didn't work for the city. That I was able to gather up a whole character set of what exists on these food cart licenses. I have no idea where these came from. The fact that the zero is called a cipher is also kind of puzzling. But there's obviously something deliberate going on here. There's gonna be some effort to avoid straight lines. Like the middle of the one is bent and the arms of the four are bent and nothing is straight for some reason. So hopefully I will figure this out at some point, but this is where I've gotten to. So that's what I have for you. Like I said, this is a work in progress. Sort of the research that I've done. I've been looking into more examples of lottery tickets, also bank checks, that perhaps some updated version of this will also include those as well. I don't want to share this much with you. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you to the Society for inviting me. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I will be haunted by the vendor permit numbers. Those are crazy. If anybody has questions, we had agreed that we would sort of open the floor up like we usually do. So feel free to unmute yourselves and maybe shout it out if nobody else seems to be talking. Actually, may I start by asking, I also love all those lottery tickets, the Parisian ones are amazing, they're gorgeous. When you say you kind of track them down, where do you find those things? Do you have to go to like flea markets in Bulgaria? Are they in archives? Are they in attics?
I was finding well, first I was finding almost all of this online in some way or another. I found a site that was very akin to eBay, but it specializes in paper ephemera. That's pretty much all it does. It's most heavily centered on stamps, but there are tens of thousands of lottery tickets on sale, and it's all out of Europe. So a great deal of what I found came from various vendors on this one
Great. Yeah.
site.
Yeah. Cool. Very cool. Very cool. I have another question that popped into my mind. I had many questions pop into my mind. If I might just throw it out there while people are thinking. The amazing, intricate, fine, like I think it was one of the first specimens that you showed us that was a proposal for a good, difficult to counterfeit specimen. You said it was like so crazy, it just seemed like a non-starter. I was curious, do you have a sense of how long it would have taken the artist to create that, just to show it as a proposal?
Oh,
is that like 6 months of work? Is it somebody's weekend? It just seems like it's a masterpiece.
Well, as I understood it, the sort of ornate lettering from that example, that was done by hand, sort of engraved by hand, but that sort of radiating pattern around it was created by his mechanical invention. It was a sort of an engraver, sort of like a kind of sort of a spirograph and a router, basically crossed with each other, that would create these patterns on a copper plate. So that was
so the lettering part. I mean, this is a pretty vague question, but it was. Do you think it would be a lot of work for somebody to put into basically like a spec, that might get shot down, which is
yeah. But he clearly had high hopes for getting this adopted. Because he had just invented this this engraving chain, so this was going to be work out really well for him if the Bank of England decided to adopt his idea.
Right.
Well, didn't the rose machine engraving concept become central to banknotes later on?
Yes, in time, in actually not that much time. Yes, it did become a central feature of banknotes and other financial instruments. And so the banks sort of missed their chance to be the first out.
I have a question. Tobias, great talk. Have you ever been commissioned to do this kind of work?
Yes.
Can
I'm sorry?
Can you talk about it?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is a thing like this that I've been working on, and I probably can't say much more about it.
All right.
Another note of intrigue. Cool.
Do features like this appear in postage stamps also?
That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of. I suspect because the postage stamps are not as lucrative targets for forgery, because the denominations that they're in are so small as compared to what you could get for banknotes. But I mean, certainly the technologies for them are right next to each other, or they're just the same. But yeah, I don't think at least I should say, not the kind of sneaky, under the water level kind of things like secret marks and so on, because normally it would just be one piece of engraving just all done at once. Yeah, I haven't heard any specific examples of that.
I have
I have
a
a
question.
question. Just wondering how forgiving or unforgiving the engraving process is. I'm thinking of that $5 bill that you showed us, where he had to go back and possibly change the reveal on that figure. Is that going back and starting from scratch, or can they patch it together somehow?
I wondered that. There was they did have or I should say, a process existed. I don't know how frequently it's being used at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. I know the American Banknote Company that printed pretty much all the stock certificates that were issued, not quite all, many of them, but also notes for a number of foreign governments. They had a system of sort of recording part of it, an engraving on a steel die that would then be rolled onto a new plate. It's the kind of modular system that they worked out, where they could sort of keep a piece of an engraving separate and sort of store it and reuse it without wearing it down. I don't know if something like that could be used to kind of replace part of a plate or not. But yeah, I wondered about that. If how they would go about revising something like that. If something could be excised and then replaced. So which is a long way of saying I don't know.
Tobias, what was your first sort of toe in the water on this subject? What was the one that got you into it?
Oh, I don't even remember. Because I've been turning this around in my head for so long, I don't even remember where it started. I do remember looking at one of the banknotes that I had, and noticing that I don't even remember what country it was, but the serial number was arranged of, let's say, however many digits or each digit was slightly larger than the one before it. And it was this, and it's not some sort of sneaky thing that was being done, it was pretty obvious. And I wondered, it's just a guess that must have been some security measure. I don't know why else it would have been done, but I remember probably thinking from there that there must be other examples of that are like this.
Tobias, do you have a favorite currency out there, design or functionally?
Oh, I was very reluctantly cut the assignats issued directly after the French Revolution. I had to cut a few things for the sake of time, but they include some really spectacular typographic devices. Some of them made by one or another member of the Dito family, others that weren't able to identify. But yeah, if you ever find any of those notes, there'll be some pretty nice surprises in there. And they can actually be pretty easy to find because so many of them were printed, which ended up being kind of a problem. But
And what are you calling them again? What is the?
assignats or assignats. they were no, sorry, I didn't just put away the version of the talk I had about an hour ago, right before I had got these 4 slides out. But yeah, they were sort of promissory notes backed by land that was confiscated from the Catholic Church. There's then, and there became a sort of ad hoc form of money, though it was never meant to be that. And the sort of chaos of those years, no one noticed that they were printing more money than the land that actually existed. So they, the value of them just bottomed out after a couple of years.
Stuart, I have a question. Tobias, as you know, Dwiggins 40 or 50 years ago wrote a little book, which the Limited Editions Club published, suggesting that the American people rise up and burn the Bureau of Engraving and Printing.
Yeah,
saying in no uncertain terms that the dollar bill was a disgrace to the nation and hadn't been revised for 100 years. Has there been any development or suggestion within the government that we take up this issue and perhaps improve it?
Well, there have been the revisions that began somewhere in the 90s to produce better, more secure paper currency, because the design hadn't changed since I think the early 20s or so. So it was, much like the white notes in England, they were long overdue for a revision. But it's I don't have any insight on how that process was managed or who was consulted about it. But it, yeah, I haven't heard anything about any further revisions that will happen. So, unlike other countries that, revise their currency every 10 or 20 years, the Americans are on a much slower schedule than that. So
100-year schedule.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't have I don't have any insight on sort of how that's done or how that's being thought about.
Well, we know who should do it, don't we?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's those. It takes a lot of different people to put those together and to sort of engineer all of those steps.
I'm curious about Australia. You had mentioned that 800 forgers in the early 19th century from Britain were sent to Australia. What did that do to Australia's, I don't know, economy or forgery situation?
It well, the find it. It's one of the more sort of, puzzling outcomes was that a what was his name? Greenway, I think. There's an architect by the name of Greenway who was whose business was failing in England, and as a sort of desperate attempt to make ends meet, forged a few notes, used his drafting skills to cook up a few notes, and was caught and sent to Australia. And ironically, his career as an architect went way better in Australia than it did in England, and built and designed many of the early governmental buildings that exist, particularly around Sydney, and became such a sort of feature of architectural history in Australia that he was eventually honored on one of the banknotes later in the 20th century as like one of the few, probably the only example of a convicted forger being, earning a spot on a piece of currency, but this guy didn't.
Wow, this good story. Did you ever
Where did
have?
you,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, I was
Go
gonna say, did you have a question? Go ahead, please.
Yes,
Sorry.
I did. I was wondering if you had interest in the lone artists who would actually copy single notes versus mass production. And did you ever come across some interesting examples of that would actually bypass all the trickeries and they would copy one note as it is?
I hadn't spent much time with that. There was an American artist whose name is escaping me, who would kind of produce these really detailed drawings of paper currency. But I think he managed to, if I'm remembering this correctly, he managed to escape prosecution by either doing just the just one side of a bill, or doing it at at some non-standard size, like it's everything is twice as big as it should be. But apart from him, I hadn't seen any examples like that.
I remember a few years back, there was a guy who was caught that had drawn a bill, and he would actually go to stores and would give the cashier his bill, and they would take it, and then he would actually tell them that was a counterfeit. And they would be always so amazed that they would return the bill to him, but they let him take the merchandise. So
Okay.
that was a funny story. Because I grew up early.
That actually reminds me, Chris, you were asking where this this idea began. Well, I realized it began from a couple of places. One of which I was on a school trip from RISD in the Netherlands in 1990 or 91. And Ocha Oxenar was one of the people organizing this this trip, and obviously he had designed one of the series of money that the Netherlands was using for many years. It was stunningly beautiful work. It was not in circulation at that time, but he still knew enough people at the Enschede Printing Works that we got to go visit there. And we saw the ways in which they were all the different sort of facets that they were using to make Dutch money harder to counterfeit, like the notes were printed using basically as many, just partially offset, partially gravure, partially letterpress. There's deliberately 3 different kinds of presses there. And at lunch, I was talking to one of the engineers of their anti-forgery unit. And he was telling me about the different schemes that they'd come across. He would only tell me about the ones that they had managed to defeat. But none of it had to do with typography per se, but it was just really fascinating to hear about what they were up against, like the person who had figured out how to cut paper so precisely that he could separate the front of a bill from the back. And he would take, 100 guilder note and slice it like this, and then just fold it in half and walk into a store and spend that and just get out before someone noticed that half of this bill is missing. They had done something with the paper to make it impossible to do that. But later, I was visiting Dawn Barrett, one of my old professors, and she was visiting a colleague of hers at the Boston Public Library. And I just happened to be there and I tagged along. And he was looking at the banknotes from the colonial era that the library had. And he was reviewing them to see which ones were genuine issues from whichever state it was, which ones were forgeries, which they still wanted to keep because they still had historical value, but they still wanted to properly identify them as being forgeries. And then there were others that he wasn't sure if they were forgeries or not. And I just took the liberty of glancing at one of them, and I was able to tell him that one of these was in fact a forgery because it used this Union Pearl typeface. It was on that Continental Congress note. And I happen to remember enough of what that typeface looks like to see that one of these letters had been fabricated incorrectly, and explain to him that, so this is why I can tell this is a forgery, because if you go look at what this Union Pearl typeface looks like, the P or the S or whatever it was doesn't actually look like that. And there's your sort of indication, and sort of the whole possibility of type as a security device appeared in full so at that point, as well as all these other clues that I've seen before that.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking like maybe 2 more questions. I do see 2 in the chat. If I may read one of them to you. The first one is from George Restrepo. George, I hope you don't mind, I'm just going to read it. The serial numbers have always interested me in US money. The close-ups of the US bills that you showed seem still familiar. In your research, have you seen them change over time?
They probably have changed. I don't recall seeing anything significant about the way they were changing. It seemed like the sort of meat of the story was sort of elsewhere on those notes, as opposed to notes from other countries, or certainly the lottery tickets or other kinds of tickets where the serial number was really the main arena.
There's one other quick question, which is pretty charming. This is from Michael McPherson.
Oh.
It says, yeah, Tobias, you were a student in my design, one class at RISD, sounds like you remember. Do you still have a wooden box for your tools that had a sign reading something like danger 40,000 volts?
Hello, Mike. Really love your class. I believe I do still have that. And yeah, that was a sign that I pried off the door of a subway substation here in Brooklyn somewhere. But yeah, I think that's still around here somewhere, at least the sign is.
Great. I thought it was probably at the time I thought it was just a warning, but now I know you had the sign for the type, not for the content. The other thing I remember is that I assigned a project to draw an object. We could select an object. Most students picked a key or a leaf or something. And you picked Scotland. And ever since then, I was very specific about what I assigned in terms of scale.
Yes. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, so these were square boards with black and white plaque.
Right. Yeah, plaque.
Yeah, there's. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but there was something that always fascinated about that shape that you see when you see that in an atlas, because it has one coast that is, so it's this sort of geometric zigzag, and then the other coast is just this shred of islands and inlets and so on. It's like one shape just
Yeah.
does not go with the other, and just this kind of just the way that looks. And so once you see that, you can't really unsee it. But
Yeah, you have to blame the glaciers for that.
yes,
Great to see you.
it's
Great
good to
talk.
see you. Thank you.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice.
Just
I
want
hear
to
a murmur.
Tobias for participating in our lecture series.
Of course,
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invite.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I I see clapping. And as I said earlier, and I assume most of you know this, we'll have this talk recorded and posted for streaming whenever you'd like. I'm sorry, I just have to point out the choreography of George and Lisa clapping in synchronized swimming fashion.
Okay.
I bet they rehearsed that. So the video for this talk, including that part, will be available within probably the next few days on our YouTube page, and the link for it will be on all the socials and our website and stuff. So this was fantastic. A really, really nice way to kick the year off, despite the fact that we have to do it, online. It's still much better than not meeting at all. So
Yes,
thank you everybody for doing this. Thank you so much, Tobias.
of course.
I'm going to
Thank
go
you.
stock some food cart vendors.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
SD.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks all.